You ever notice how we're wrapped in 2 blankets inside a house with central heating, wearing fuzzy socks, and we still complain? Now freeze this scene. Imagine trying to explain your shivering to a Native American elder from 600 years ago, who just slept in a wind-blasted prairie inside a teepee with no electricity, no puffy jacket, and definitely no heated mattress pad. Yet, he's fine. Meanwhile, you're one draft away from calling it a medical emergency.
So the real question is, how the heck did they do it?
Because this cold, this incredible cold, this was every single winter, every year for centuries. Native Americans didn't just survive the cold, they slept through it, in tents, on the ground, with actual snow falling outside. Stick around to the end because the last secret that they used to beat the cold will make you question if we're really the advanced ones.
All right, so let's clear something up right now.
You hear the word tent, and your brain jumps to that flimsy nylon thing from summer camp that leaks if you breathe too hard. So naturally, you assume Native Americans just sat around all night, shivering, teeth clacking like castanets, praying for morning, right? Yeah, not even close. The kind of tents they created were called teepee, and the teepee wasn't some sad fabric hut flapping in the wind. It was a straight-up survival capsule. This thing was engineered, and not by accident. It had a tall, conical shape made with strong wooden poles, covered in layered buffalo hides that acted like nature's insulation, thick enough to block wind, breathable enough to let moisture out. That's not just a tent. That's prehistoric climate control.
Now here's where it gets clever. In the center of the teepee, they'd build a small fire, not a raging bonfire, just enough to keep things warm and cozy. The smoke would drift upward and exit through a special hole at the top that could be adjusted depending on wind direction. So, no, they weren't all choking on smoke like rookies. They controlled airflow like tent architects.
And that heat, it would rise, hit the top, circulate down the sides, and keep the inside temperature surprisingly stable. We're talking 15 to 25 degrees warmer than outside, even in the dead of winter. Anthropologist Reginald Laubin, who lived with Plains tribes and literally wrote the book, The Indian Teepee, Its History, Construction, and Use, co-authored with his wife, Gladys, studied this firsthand and confirmed the teepee's ability to stay warm in winter, cool in summer, and dry in storms. Now, yes, there was a trade-off. If you sat too close to the fire, congratulations, your butt just became a charcoal briquette. Too far, you're hugging your knees and regretting life. So yes, balance was key. But really, what they created was the first open-plan studio apartment. Built-in smoke ventilation, underfloor heating powered by logs, multi-season temperature control. And guess what? It could be packed up and moved across the plains in under an hour. So next time someone says they just lived in tents, you tell them, nope, they lived in portable climate-controlled homes, designed to survive nature with no Wi-Fi, no IKEA, and absolutely zero help from Elon Musk.
Forget your thermal leggings and fleece hoodie. These folks wrapped themselves in buffalo hides so thick you could probably bounce an arrow off it.
Elk, deer, rabbit, whatever they hunted, they wore. And they didn't just throw one on and call it a night. Oh no, it was layer on layer, a burrito of survival. They'd sleep inside the hides, not just under them. Picture someone rolled up tighter than a Chipotle wrap, with their face barely poking out for air. That was bedtime. And guess what else kept the warmth flowing? People. Yep, literal body heat. Families didn't spread out for comfort. They bunched up like human Tetris blocks. Why? Because science. The more bodies packed together, the warmer the shared heat. So if you thought sleeping with your cousins meant 2 bunk beds and a Nintendo, nope. It meant 6 humans, 1 dog, and possibly a baby goat snoring in a pile of elk fur, trying not to let a cold foot touch your back. And that wasn't even seen as weird. It was strategy. The cold wasn't something they feared. It was something they prepared for, together. Every hide, every shared breath, every snuggle was part of the plan. Survival wasn't a solo mission. It was a family-sized operation. So next time you're mad about sharing a blanket, remember, these people shared their entire sleeping body heat network like it was Wi-Fi, only stronger and warmer. So we've talked about the teepee, we've talked about the fur burrito sleep system, we've even talked about turning your cousins into human heaters. But Native American winter survival didn't stop there. No, they had one more trick up their deerskin sleeve. Hot rocks. Yeah, you heard that right. When modern humans think of staying warm, they think, plug it in, press a button, boom, heat. But back then, they looked around and said, we've got fire, and we've got rocks. Let's make magic.
Before bedtime, they'd toss specially chosen stones, usually smooth river rocks, straight into the fire. These weren't random driveway pebbles. They knew which stones wouldn't crack or explode from the heat. Once they were warm enough, they'd wrap them in bark, animal hide, or thick cloth, then slide them under bedding next to feet or even snuggle them under their layers.
Basically, prehistoric hot water bottles.
And guess what? These things worked.
The heat lasted for hours, radiating slow and steady warmth like a little sleeping fireball. You didn't just fall asleep warm, you stayed warm. It wasn't high-tech, but it was highly effective. They didn't have electric blankets. They had volcanic cuddle stones.
Primitive?
Yeah. Insane?
Effective?
Absolutely. Some tribes even used heated stones strategically. They placed them around the inside edges of the teepee floor, creating this low, slow release of heat that kept the space from freezing over. That's not caveman nonsense. That's thermal engineering. And it gets better. The next morning, those same rocks were reheated and used again, sometimes tucked into clothing pouches for warmth during travel. It was like carrying around your own little pocket sun.
Meanwhile, today,
if the power goes out for 3 hours, we're running around in panic, layering up like onions and texting our neighbors for backup chargers. But hundreds of years ago, someone sat in silence, curled around a glowing rock, surviving the night with nothing but nature, knowledge, and a well-placed piece of granite. These weren't just cozy survival hacks your grandpa made up in a dream. Anthropologists like Reginald and Gladys Laubine, who literally lived with Plains tribes and documented it all in their book, The Indian Teepee, Its History, Construction, and Use, describe how heated stones were a core part of the winter setup. So yeah, hot rocks may sound simple, but they're proof that real warmth doesn't come from tech. It comes from knowing what to do and having the guts to sleep beside lava in a leather pouch. What about the wind? Because winter wind doesn't care about your cozy vibes. It will snake its icy little fingers under the walls and right into your sleeping space like it owns the place. But Native Americans weren't just survivalists. They were weatherproofing pros. Let's start with the first line of defense: snow walls. In deep winter, many Plains tribes would literally pile snow around the base of the teepee, not for decoration, but as a cold-blocking barrier. Think of it like medieval caulking, made out of frozen nature. These snow walls helped seal off the bottom edge of the teepee, where wind loved to sneak in. It created an insulation buffer. Why does this matter? Because cold air settles low. If you let wind get underneath your shelter, it crawls across the ground like a silent ice ghost. Next thing you know, everyone's curled into one fur burrito on the floor, questioning their life decisions. So, they stopped that problem before it started. Now for the second defense system: hide skirts. Some tribes used extra strips of animal hide and tied them around the entire bottom of the teepee, a full 360-degree seal. This created a kind of leather fringe at the base that blocked drafts and hugged the ground. Not just stylish, functional. This setup wasn't a luxury. It was strategic armor against nature's coldest ambush. And don't forget, these weren't small gusts of air. We're talking about prairie winds, sharp, cutting, relentless. No trees for cover, just wide open plains and nothing but raw atmosphere hitting your face like a slap made of ice. So, next time you're yelling at your landlord because cold air is coming through the window frame, just remember, they were out here building entire snow fortresses around their houses without duct tape, foam sealant, or a complaints hotline. And here's the real kicker. This wasn't even considered extra work. This was normal, expected. You see a snowstorm coming, you grab a shovel or your hands and you start stacking snow like it's a protective moat. Some groups even dug shallow trenches around the base of their shelter to channel wind away or drain melted snow. That's not survival, that's environmental design. And it worked. All these small tweaks, snow mounds, hide skirts, fire placement, they layered together into a system. One that kept people alive, warm, and asleep through storms that would send most modern folks running to book a hotel. And let's be real for a second. We complain about cold inside a building that has insulation, drywall, and something called a thermostat. They were camping on open plains in the middle of blizzards, in portable homes, using nothing but stone, skin, and serious brainpower. And if you think this sounds like overkill for a tent, you should read what E. Adamson Hobel wrote. In his study of the Cheyenne, he explained how they'd pack snow around the base, tie on hide skirts, and even rotate their teepees to block harsh prairie winds. These weren't accidents. They were climate control strategies baked into daily life.
So no, Native American teepees were not just fabric tents flapping in the wind. They were fully upgraded winter bunkers with nature-built insulation and zero electricity required. Because when the wind came knocking, they didn't flinch.
But even after all of that, there's one thing that really explains why Native Americans didn't just survive the cold. They owned it. It wasn't just the tools, it was the mentality. They didn't see winter as the enemy. They didn't sit around hoping it would go away or shaking their fists at the sky like cartoon characters. They respected the cold. They studied it, prepared for it, adapted their entire rhythm of life around it. Unlike today, where we tend to battle nature, crank the heat, curse the weather app, and blame the wind for ruining our hair, Native American tribes worked with nature, not against it. For many tribes, movement was key. They shifted camp depending on the season. That's right, if a spot got too exposed or too windy, they didn't just stay there and complain. They relocated. Imagine someone in 2025 saying, "Yeah, it's a bit drafty here. Let's move the whole neighborhood 3 miles south." You'd get strange looks. Back then, that was just Tuesday. It was a survival-first mindset. Everything, where they slept, what they ate, how they built, how they layered, was done with the question in mind. How do we work with this season, not fight it? That's the difference. And when things got tough, they didn't wait around for a rescue helicopter or blame the thermostat. They were the thermostat. They read the land. They read the sky. They were the weather app. They didn't rely on someone else fixing the cold. They relied on each other, on shared knowledge, instinct, and trust in the old ways. Think about that. Today, one power cut and half the neighborhood's panicking, triple wrapping themselves in bathrobes, microwaving socks, and Googling how to survive a blackout without crying. But centuries ago, people were sleeping calmly in minus 20-degree weather because they understood their environment. Because they've been taught, generation after generation, how to stay warm by design, not just by gadgets. They didn't just build warm shelters. They built a culture around respecting nature's extremes. Researcher Fikret Berkes, who studied indigenous ecological knowledge systems, explained that survival wasn't just about tactics. It was about a shared understanding of how to live with the land, not over it. What kept native communities alive through brutal winters wasn't just fire and fur. It was generational memory rooted in respect, humility, and adaptation. Even the way they taught their children reflected this. Kids didn't grow up terrified of the cold. They learned how to read the wind, find dry wood in snow, and understand why one type of fur worked better than another. That knowledge wasn't written down. It was lived, every day, until it became instinct. That's the part that gets forgotten. We remember the teepees and the fire pits and the buffalo robes, but we forget the mindset, the humility, the patience, the planning. Because survival wasn't just about skill, it was about wisdom. So if you're ever out there complaining about winter being too harsh, remember this. Someone, 600 years ago, walked outside into a blizzard, made a fire by hand, wrapped themselves in elk skin, threw some hot stones under their bedding, sealed their teepee with snow and hide, and slept just fine. No panic, no problem, just respect, resourcefulness, and the quiet confidence of someone who learned how to listen to the land. Now that's real survival. Not because they had to fight nature, but because they knew how to live with it. And there's another twist that most people don't think about. They didn't just wait for winter to end. They traveled, they hunted, they worked, in the snow and the cold. And they did it with more grace and fewer falls than most of us pulling out of a driveway after 2 inches of slush. So how did they do it? Let's start with the big one, snowshoes. Native Americans figured out early on that walking through deep snow is basically like trying to jog in mashed potatoes. It doesn't work. So they built snowshoes. Large, light, webbed frames made of bent wood and rawhide lacing. These shoes spread out your weight across the snow, so instead of sinking, you glide. It's not a new idea. It's an old one. A really smart, really well-tested one. And guess what? They didn't all use the same style. Tribes adapted the shape and size depending on their region. In the forests of the Northeast, longer snowshoes helped with stride and maneuvering through brush. In the plains and tundra, they made them shorter and rounder for wide open ground. And yes, these aren't just stories from campfire legends. The 1909 Museum Journal makes it clear that snowshoes were survival tools, not toys. Modern scholars in snowshoes and indigenous winter ecologies show how indigenous communities
fine-tune these designs using deep environmental knowledge to match terrain and climate. And a detailed history of snowshoeing confirms tribes across North America created at least 4 different models, like Ontario-style beaver tail and Alaska-style narrow frames, ingeniously built to move in snow without sinking.
Meanwhile, your cousin still falls every winter just walking to the mailbox.
Then you've got the sleds and toboggans, especially among Arctic and subarctic tribes like the Cree, Inuit, and Chipewyan.
These weren't toy sleds for sliding down the hill. They were workhorses, made of birch or pine, often pulled by dogs or even people. They hauled firewood, food, game, tools, everything.
If you're picturing a plastic toboggan from Walmart, delete that thought.
These were streamlined, flexible, and built to move through snow without getting buried.
And the clothing? Forget your waterproof parka that barely lasts one season.
They wore buffalo hide outer layers, fur-lined moccasins, and layered garments tailored for wind resistance, movement, and insulation.
They weren't dressing to impress, they were dressing to survive and move fast. Even the paths they traveled were part of the genius. Trails weren't just randomly made, they were memorized, shared, and passed down like living maps. Some of these paths were so efficient they became the base routes for later colonial roads and modern highways. That's how deep this knowledge ran. And it wasn't just physical tools, it was muscle memory, passed from elder to child. Follow the windbreak, stick to the tree line, avoid that ridge after a snowstorm. No GPS, no Google Maps, just pure ancestral navigation.
Let's just be honest for a second.
Today, most of us can't even find our own driveway when it's covered in snow. Meanwhile, someone 500 years ago was hauling elk meat across a frozen valley, in handmade footwear, pulling a sled, in a snowstorm, without slipping. And we call ourselves advanced? Torque. The truth is, Native American winter mobility wasn't just impressive. It was a science and an art. Everything they used had purpose. Everything had been refined by trial, error, observation, and patience over generations.
They didn't need high-tech materials or carbon fiber frames. They needed skill, understanding, and respect for the land they moved through.
So no, they weren't frozen in place all winter. They moved, they adapted, they thrived. Not because it was easy, but because they knew how to walk with winter, not against it. And they did it all without snowplows, seat warmers, or complaining about icy sidewalks on Twitter. So now that you know the full story, the teepee engineering, the fur burritos, the volcanic cuddle stones, the windproofing hacks, and the mindset sharper than the wind itself, there's really just one question left.
Could you survive a single snowy night in one of these tents? No phone, no heater, no Netflix. Just your body heat, your brain, maybe a cousin or two, and a couple of very toasty rocks wrapped in animal hide. Would you be building a snow wall and stoking a fire like a champ? Or crying in the corner because your thermal socks aren't doing enough?
Now here's the challenge, and don't chicken out. Drop a comment below and tell me what you would bring if you had to spend one winter night in a teepee.
And no, you cannot say AirPods or a power bank.
I mean real gear, real survival picks.
Would you bring bear fat stew, heated stones, a backup cousin? Let's see how creative and how honest you are. Because while most of us today would last about 3 hours before begging for a hotel with central heating, the people who lived this way, they didn't just survive, they slept soundly while snow fell outside.
So yeah, maybe it's time we stopped underestimating them.
And maybe, just maybe, it's time we stopped underestimating what we're capable of too.
Your move. What are you packing?
If you learned something new or now feel even slightly less dramatic about winter, hit that like button. Share this with someone who complains when the AC is too cold, and subscribe for more Native American stories that prove our ancestors were way tougher than we are.